What if the greatest act of courage wasn't standing your ground, but crossing it? Picture a medieval battlefield where the air is thick with the clash of steel and the cries of warriors. But amid the chaos, some did the unthinkable. They turned their backs on their banners, their kings, even their own people, and stepped across enemy lines. Not for glory, not for gold, but for love, for survival, for a chance at something more than war. These are the untold stories of deserters and defenders who defied the rigid rules of medieval conflict, rewriting their fates with every forbidden step. The Middle Ages are often remembered as a time of unshakable loyalty, where knights lived by codes and soldiers died for causes. But history is messier than the legends let on. Behind every castle wall and battle line, there were real people who fell in love with the wrong side, who chose bread over blades, or who simply refused to die for a lord they'd never met. These weren't just traitors or cowards. They were fathers, lovers, and dreamers caught in an impossible world. Their choices reveal a truth we rarely hear, that even in the darkest ages, humanity couldn't be contained by borders or bloodshed. So today, we're peeling back the layers of chainmail and parchment to uncover these hidden lives. You'll meet a knight who abandoned his post to marry his enemy's daughter, a peasant who smuggled food to starving soldiers on both sides of a siege, and a defector whose betrayal became the key to peace. These aren't just footnotes, they're proof that war is never as simple as us versus them. And by the end, you'll see the Middle Ages in a whole new light, not as a time of mindless violence, but as an era where love and survival could bend even the hardest hearts. Ready to cross the line? Let's begin. To understand why so many medieval soldiers risked everything to desert, we have to strip away the romanticized tales of chivalry and face the brutal truth. Life in a medieval army was often unbearable. Imagine marching for weeks in sodden wool, your stomach gnawing with hunger because supply wagons never arrived. Picture sleeping in mud, praying the fever wouldn't take you before the enemy did. For every knight in shining armor, there were 100-foot soldiers, conscripted peasants, pressed into service with no choice, handed a spear and told to die for a lord who wouldn't know their names. When the promised pay never came, when disease ravaged the camp, when the cause felt hollow as a drum, is it any wonder some chose to run? The punishment for desertion was meant to terrify. Captured fugitives might be hanged, their bodies left to rot as warnings. Some were branded with hot irons, marked as traitors for life, but fear couldn't stop the desperate. In the winter of 1387, during a particularly grueling campaign in France, entire units of English archers vanished overnight, melting into the forests rather than face another starvation winter. Records from the Burgundian Wars tell of soldiers who deliberately maimed themselves, breaking fingers or burning their own feet to escape service. These weren't acts of cowardice, but of survival. And then there were those who didn't just flee, but crossed to the other side. A German mercenary in Italy might swap allegiances for a warmer cloak and a full belly. A Scottish clansman captured in battle might join his former enemies if they offered land instead of a noose. The most fascinating cases, spies who turned double agents, like the infamous Green Knight of Castile, a disgraced nobleman who fed false troop movements to both sides, playing them against each other until he could disappear with a stolen fortune. But the greatest taboo wasn't betraying a king, it was betraying blood. In border regions like Wales or the Balkans, where village loyalties ran deeper than fealty to distant crowns, brothers sometimes found themselves on opposite sides of a siege. Chroniclers whisper of soldiers lowering ropes to let kin escape besieged castles, or deliberately missing shots when facing family across the battlefield. These quiet acts of rebellion reveal a truth the Chronicles rarely admit. Even in an age of absolutes, loyalty was never black and white. It was a frayed rope stretched taut between duty and love. Defection wasn't always an act of desperation. Sometimes it was a cold, calculated gamble. While deserters fled to escape suffering, another breed of turncoats walked toward the enemy with their eyes wide open. These were the defenders who switched sides, men who weighed loyalty against opportunity and found their oaths lighter than gold. Take the case of Sir William de la Pole, an English knight who defected to France during the 100 Years' War. Disgusted by his king's broken promises of land and titles, he made a show of surrendering his sword only to return months later as a commander in the French army, leading raids against his former comrades. His betrayal wasn't born of fear but of fury. For others, defection was less about vengeance and more about profit. Mercenaries, the freelance soldiers of the medieval world, were notorious for flipping allegiances mid-campaign. A Lombard crossbowman might swear fealty to Milan in the morning and Venice by dusk if the pay was right. Chroniclers tell of entire mercenary companies, like the infamous White Company in Italy, who auctioned their services to the highest bidder. Their motto might as well have been, "No flags, only coins." Then there were the master manipulators, double agents who turned betrayal into an art form. Consider the shadowy figure of Jan Žižka before he became a Hussite hero. Early in his career, he fought for both Polish and Bohemian lords, playing them against each other while gathering intelligence. His real loyalty to himself, these men thrived in the chaos of war, exploiting the fog of battle to weave webs of deception. A castle gate left unbarred, a message intercepted at just the right moment, small acts that tilted battles, all while the traitor collected payments from both sides. But what drove a man to willingly betray his own? Sometimes it was sheer disillusionment. Many defenders who switched sides had watched their lords waste lives in pointless feuds or hoard plunder meant for the ranks. The medieval equivalent of a toxic workplace, if your boss could also have you hanged for complaining. In the Scottish Wars of Independence, entire garrisons surrendered to Robert the Bruce after their English commanders withheld food and pay. As one chronicler put it, a hungry man owes no loyalty to a full belly. Yet even in this world of shifting sands, some defections carried a strange nobility. The story of Owain Lorgach, a Welsh prince who fought for the French against the English crown, wasn't just about ambition. It was about reclaiming a homeland his family had lost. His betrayal was, in his eyes, a return to older loyalties. Likewise, Byzantine generals who defected to the Ottomans often did so to protect their people from slaughter, trading their honor for mercy. The thin line between opportunist and survivor blurred most in borderlands where today's enemy might be tomorrow's kin. Along the shifting frontiers of Spain during the Reconquista, Moorish and Christian knights occasionally swapped sides, bringing their skills and secrets with them. These defectors became cultural bridges, introducing new tactics, technologies, and even recipes across enemy lines. One renegade Christian knight, known as El Cid Campeador, became a legend precisely because he fought for both sides, his loyalty as fluid as the territory he sought to rule. In the end, every defector carried a story more complex than the word traitor could contain. Some sought gold, others justice, some acted from spite, a few from love. But their collective legacy reveals an uncomfortable truth. In the Middle Ages, as now, the sides of any conflict were never as solid as they seemed. The real borders weren't drawn on maps, they ran through the human heart, where duty, desire, and survival waged their own endless war. Love could be as dangerous as any sword in the Middle Ages, especially when it crossed enemy lines. While kings waged wars over land and honor, ordinary soldiers and nobles alike sometimes found their hearts pulling them in entirely different directions. Take the astonishing case of Ulrich von Liechtenstein, a German knight who allegedly disguised himself as a wandering minstrel to sneak into a rival lord's castle, all to serenade the man's daughter. Poetry and passion, it seems, could breach walls that armies couldn't. These forbidden romances weren't just fleeting trysts, some altered the course of history. In 12th century Jerusalem, during the brutal Crusades, a Frankish knight named Bertrand fell in love with a Muslim noblewoman named Zainab. When their secret meetings were discovered, Bertrand faced execution for treason until Zainab's family intervened, sparking negotiations that temporarily halted the fighting. For a brief moment, love became a truce, but not all stories ended so peacefully. The Chronicles of medieval Spain tell of a Christian squire and a Moorish silk weaver's daughter who fled Granada together, only to be hunted down by both sides. Their crime, loving across a religious divide their world refused to bridge. Yet even in tragedy, these couples left a mark, their stories whispered through taverns and troubadour songs, proving that human connection could outshine even the brightest armor. The risks were unimaginable by modern standards. A noblewoman caught aiding an enemy lover might be walled up in a convent, her lands forfeited. A common soldier faced worse, flogging, mutilation, or worse. But still they dared. In the borderlands between Scotland and England, where raids and reprisals were constant, local ballads tell of a young archer who smuggled his sweetheart, a baker's daughter, from the wrong side of the conflict out of a besieged town in an empty grain barrel. They vanished into the highlands, leaving war behind. What drove people to risk everything? Perhaps it was the sheer intensity of life in wartime, where every day might be your last. Or maybe, after years of being told who to hate, some simply chose who to love instead. Like the Hungarian mercenary and Ottoman scribe who met during a prisoner exchange and later fled to Venice, where they opened a shop selling both Christian icons and Islamic calligraphy, a quiet rebellion against the divisions that had once defined them. These stories force us to rethink the Middle Ages. Beyond the battles and betrayals, there were always people who refused to let hatred have the final word. Their legacies live on in folk songs, in whispered family histories, and in the stubborn truth that even in the darkest times, love found a way, not with a banner, but with a stolen kiss, a hidden note, or a desperate dash into the unknown. Escaping the battlefield was just the beginning. The real test came after, when deserters had to vanish into a world that hunted them relentlessly. Imagine stripping off your soldier's tunic, burying it in the dirt, and stepping into a new identity with nothing but your wits to keep you alive. Some became master illusionists, blending into peasant life with practiced ease. A former archer might trade his bow for a plow, callousing his hands until no one questioned why he flinched at the sound of marching boots. Others sought refuge in the chaos of mercenary companies, where questions were rare and new faces routine. The luckiest slipped into monasteries, where the rhythm of prayer and penance offered cover, though even holy walls couldn't always stop a determined bounty hunter. Forgery became a lifeline. With the right wax seal and a steady hand, a deserter could transform into a traveling merchant or a pilgrim bound for distant shrines. Records from 15th century France mention a charcoal burner near Bordeaux who turned out to be a disgraced knight. His forged pardons so convincing local officials never doubted him. More daring still were those who bribed their way to freedom. A handful of silver to a corrupt quartermaster might prove you died in battle, your name quietly scratched from the rolls. One English deserter in the 100 Years' War even paid a scribe to record his fictional death by dysentery, a humiliating end perhaps, but preferable to the noose. Geography offered its own tricks. Border regions thrived as havens for the disappeared, where overlapping laws and grudges made extradition a joke. The forests of the Black Forest or the Scottish Highlands swallowed men whole, their trails vanishing beneath dense canopies. Coastal deserters sometimes stowed away on fishing boats, trading military service for a life hauling nets, assuming they could stomach the sea. And in cities, anonymity was currency. A former soldier might grow a beard, change his accent, and lose himself in the stinking alleys of London or Naples, where every face was a stranger and loyalty lasted as long as the next meal. But the most audacious survivors didn't hide, they reinvented. Take the case of Hans Müller, a Swiss pikeman who deserted after the Battle of Nancy and resurfaced years later as a respected surgeon in Strasbourg. He'd learned enough battlefield medicine to bluff his way into a new profession, his past buried under layers of borrowed knowledge. Or the group of Burgundian deserters who posed as traveling actors, their plays just exaggerated retellings of battles they'd fled. Their audiences never guessed the blood-stained realism came from experience. Yet for all their cunning, deserters lived on borrowed time. A careless word, a recognized scar, or a former comrade stumbling into the wrong tavern could unravel years of caution. Price of failure was brutal public hanging, limbs severed as warning or worse, but still they risked it because beneath every disguise, every forged paper, lay the same unshakable truth: these weren't men who feared death. They were men who refused to die for nothing. And in that refusal, they carved out something extraordinary, not just survival, but a life worth living. Mercenary bands were the ultimate gray area of medieval warfare, a shadow world where deserters could vanish and reinvent themselves overnight. These freelance armies cared little for crowns or causes. Their loyalty was to silver and survival. For a soldier fleeing his king's justice, joining a mercenary company wasn't just an escape, it was a promotion. Your old uniform might mark you as a traitor, but your sword arm. That was always employable. The White Company, one of Italy's most infamous mercenary bands, actively recruited deserters from both French and English forces during the 100 Years' War. Their leader, Sir John Hawkwood, famously quipped, "A man's past matters less than his ability to hold a pike." These companies became melting pots of the disillusioned, disgraced knights fighting alongside peasant deserters, all united by the promise of plunder and a clean slate. Payment records from Florence reveal that some mercenaries used aliases so blatantly false, John No Name, Thomas from Nowhere, that everyone understood the truth but politely looked away. What made mercenary bands so perfect for fugitives? Their very structure defied medieval norms. Unlike royal armies bound by feudal oaths, these companies operated as mobile democracies. Leaders were elected, pay was negotiated, and contracts could be abandoned if a better offer came along. A deserter slipping into their ranks didn't just find safety, he found camaraderie among fellow outcasts. Swiss chronicles describe entire units of German deserters welcomed into pikemen formations, their past sins erased by the shared language of combat. But the arrangement wasn't charity. Mercenary captains prized deserters for their insider knowledge. A French knight who'd switched sides could reveal his former army's weak points. An English longbowman might teach new formations. This two-way trade in skills and secrets made mercenary bands terrifyingly effective. During the Wars of the Roses, one Lancastrian deserter led Yorkist mercenaries through a hidden ford to ambush his former comrades, a betrayal that turned the tide at the Battle of Edgecote. The church railed against these godless bands, and kings issued decrees ordering mercenaries to return deserters. Few complied. In fact, some captains actively sabotaged manhunts. When Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III sent bounty hunters after a group of Bohemian deserters in 1462, the mercenary leader Francesco Sforza hid them in plain sight, disguised as his personal bodyguard. The emperor's agents never suspected a thing. This symbiotic relationship reshaped warfare itself. As mercenary ranks swelled with seasoned deserters, their tactics grew more sophisticated. They pioneered early forms of psychological warfare, using turncoats to spread false rumors or feign retreats that lured enemies into traps. A Venetian account describes how former Byzantine deserters in a Genoese mercenary company replicated their old empire's fire signals to misdirect Ottoman forces. Every deserter brought not just another sword, but another piece of the enemy's playbook. Yet life in a mercenary band was no fairy tale. Contracts ran short, winters were harsh, and betrayal always loomed. The same captain who offered refuge today might sell you to the highest bidder tomorrow, but for men with nowhere else to go, it was a gamble worth taking. In the end, these companies didn't just harbor deserters, they proved a radical idea: that in a world obsessed with loyalty to kings and lands, sometimes the strongest bond was simply between those who'd all chosen to walk away. History often paints medieval warfare as a man's world, but scratch beneath the surface, and you'll find women who didn't just witness the chaos, they manipulated it. While chroniclers obsessed over kings and knights, countless women slipped across battle lines, not as passive victims, but as strategists, survivors, and even soldiers. Take the astonishing case of Jean Lesnay, a French teenager who allegedly disguised herself as a stable boy to infiltrate an English camp during the 100 Years' War, stealing troop movements that saved her besieged village. Her story wasn't unique, just rarely told. For some women, war offered an unexpected escape from rigid medieval gender roles. In an age when a peasant woman's life was dictated by fathers, husbands, or convents, slipping into soldier's garb meant freedom. German archives mention a woman known only as Long Margaret, who served as a pikeman for 12 years before her sex was discovered. Her punishment: a fine for deceiving her comrades, but no prison. Why? Because by then she'd fought in 7 battles and saved her captain's life twice. Even the law couldn't deny her skill. Others used their invisibility as weapons. Noble women, assumed to be harmless by enemy forces, became masterful spies. The Countess of Montfort famously smuggled messages inside hollowed-out loaves of bread during the Breton War of Succession. Her enemy, never suspecting the elegant woman overseeing the kitchen, was relaying their every move. Meanwhile, in Moorish Spain, Jewish and Muslim women already navigating multiple cultures became essential go-betweens, their fluency in languages and knowledge of secret routes making them invaluable to both sides. Then there were those who turned the battlefield's chaos into opportunity. Italian mercenary bands occasionally included women disguised as camp followers who'd suddenly reveal themselves as skilled archers mid-battle, their arrows finding marks before the enemy processed the shock. The most legendary, a woman recorded as Sister Marie the Bow, who fought alongside the Burgundians until a wound exposed her secret. Instead of executing her, the Duke hired her as a weapons instructor, the medieval equivalent of a corporate headhunter poaching top talent. But perhaps the most heartbreaking stories belong to women who crossed lines not for glory, but for love. Welsh ballads sing of Gwenllian Fyrch Rhys, who led a nighttime raid to free her imprisoned husband, only to be captured herself. Her final act, distributing her hidden dagger to fellow prisoners, sparking an uprising that allowed dozens to escape. And in the Byzantine Empire, Anna Komnene's Chronicles hint at unnamed women who sneaked into enemy camps to negotiate their children's safety, offering medical knowledge in exchange for mercy. These women didn't just defy expectations, they exploited them. In a world that saw them as weak, they weaponized that assumption. When guards searched wagons for contraband, they rarely checked the birthing pallets where messages lay hidden. When armies needed fresh bread, no one questioned the bakers who memorized fort layouts. And when a serving girl stumbled into the wrong tent, who would guess she was counting swords? Their legacy whispers a truth we're only now uncovering. That medieval warfare wasn't just shaped by those who stood their ground, but by those who moved unseen between them, turning the margins into a battlefield of their own. In the shadow of every medieval battlefield stood another kind of refuge, one not made of stone walls or mercenary contracts, but of faith. Churches and monasteries across Europe opened their doors to deserters, offering sanctuary under the ancient Christian principle that holy ground was inviolable. A fleeing soldier had only to touch the knocker of a cathedral door or grasp the altar cloth, and by law he was untouchable, at least in theory. This sacred tradition turned monasteries into waystations for the desperate, where a man could trade his sword for a monk's robe and his past for prayer. But divine protection had its limits. While abbots and bishops thundered about the sin of violating sanctuary, kings and lords often turned a deaf ear. In 1184, when a group of English deserters sought refuge at St. Albans Abbey, King Henry II's men simply waited outside for 40 days, the legal limit for sanctuary, then dragged the starving men into the sunlight to hang them from the abbey walls. The message was clear: God's mercy ended where a monarch's wrath began. Some religious houses fought back with cunning. The monks of Cluny in France became notorious for helping deserters disappear, smuggling them out through hidden tunnels beneath the choir stalls. Others played legal games. Durham Cathedral's records show monks deliberately mistaking a deserter's arrival to reset the 40-day clock, buying him time to plan an escape. And then there were the truly audacious, like the Breton monastery, that declared an entire forest adjacent to its lands as extended sanctuary, creating a sprawling no-man's land where fugitives lived like hermits under the church's tacit protection. Yet sanctuary was never a perfect shield. A vengeful lord might bribe a corrupt priest to look the other way, or claim the deserter had committed some new crime, blasphemy, theft, that nullified the protection. In Spain during the Reconquista, Moorish deserters who sought Christian sanctuary sometimes found themselves betrayed by clergy eager to prove their loyalty to the crown. And in rare, dark cases, entire communities paid the price. The village of Orada-sur-Glane was burned in 1348 after rumors spread that its church had harbored army deserters. The tension between cross and crown created bizarre legal dramas. One 14th-century case in Avignon saw a papal court debate whether a deserter who'd taken vows as a monk could still be tried for military abandonment. The verdict: he couldn't, but only if his conversion was deemed sincere. Cynics noted how conveniently sincere many soldiers became when facing the gallows. What's most revealing, though, are the stories of those who stayed. Some deserters, genuinely transformed by sanctuary, became lay brothers or scribes, their military pasts erased by years of quiet service. The Chronicle of Fountains Abbey mentions a former archer who spent decades illuminating manuscripts, his steady hand once used for bows now painting saints' halos. Others turned their skills to the church's defense, like the one-eyed mercenary who became a monastery's gatekeeper, his knowledge of siege tactics helping fortify the very walls that had saved him. This uneasy dance between mercy and power speaks volumes about medieval society. Sanctuary wasn't just a theological idea, it was a battleground where the spiritual and secular worlds collided. Every time a monk hid a deserter or a king kicked in a chapel door, they were arguing, in their way, over who really ruled the medieval world. the laws of heaven or the whims of earthly power. And in that struggle, even the most desperate fugitive became an unwitting soldier in a much older war. The crack of the whip, the sear of hot iron on flesh, these were the sounds and smells that haunted medieval armies, the brutal language of discipline meant to terrify any soldier thinking of desertion. A captured deserter could expect no mercy in most cases. English records from the 100 Years' War describe men hanged from gallows erected on the very roads they'd tried to flee down, their bodies left to rot as gruesome signposts. The French preferred branding, marking a deserter's forehead with a fleur-de-lis so even if he escaped justice, he'd never escape shame. And in the Holy Roman Empire, some commanders took inspiration from ancient Rome, executing every 10th man in a unit that had mutinied, a practice chillingly called decimation. Yet for all the horror, these punishments had a flaw. They assumed fear alone could glue an army together. In reality, seasoned commanders knew terror had limits. During the brutal Lombard Wars, one Italian captain noted in his journal that after hanging 3 deserters, 5 more vanished the next night. "The rope stops the feet but not the heart," he wrote. Some leaders began to question whether cruelty was counterproductive. In 1421, the Burgundian Marshal Jean de Luxembourg made a startling decision after catching 12 archers trying to desert. Instead of executing them, he assembled his entire army, then handed the men shovels, their punishment digging latrines for the camp while their comrades laughed. The humiliation, he argued, would linger longer than any lash marks. And he was right. Not one of those archers ran again, and desertions in his ranks dropped by half. Clever commanders also realized that sometimes the threat of punishment was more effective than the act itself. The Welsh rebel Owain Glyndwr perfected psychological warfare with his deserters. Those caught fleeing his army weren't immediately killed instead. They were forced to stand barefoot in the snow outside his tent for hours, listening to the feast inside. Only when their toes turned blue would they be dragged in to face judgment, their fate decided by whether Glyndwr was in a merciful mood after his 3rd cup of wine. This unpredictability made his soldiers more afraid of deserting than of battle. But the rarest and most fascinating cases were those where mercy triumphed outright. During the Siege of Neuss in 1474, a young German spearman named Conrad was caught trying to lower himself from the city walls. His captain, instead of ordering execution, quietly handed him a letter to deliver to a nearby relief force, effectively turning his desertion into a mission. Conrad succeeded, the reinforcements arrived, and his punishment became a promotion. Similarly, Byzantine generals sometimes offered deserters a stark choice: death or redeployment to the empire's farthest frontier. Many chose the latter, becoming border guards in Armenia or Crimea, where their desperation to prove loyalty made them ferocious defenders, the truth lurking behind these grim tales. Medieval justice wasn't as one-dimensional as we imagine. Yes, the punishments were horrific, but they existed alongside moments of startling pragmatism, even compassion. A starving peasant dragged into service might be flogged for desertion, but the nobleman's son who fled his first battle might get a stern lecture and extra guard duty. The difference often came down to value. Could the army afford to lose this man's skills? Did his connections make him too dangerous to punish? Even in an age of absolutes, survival sometimes trumped ideology. Perhaps the most telling detail comes from a faded payroll ledger in Venice's archives. Next to the name of one crossbowman, the scribe wrote not executed or branded, but simply gone. No explanation, no pursuit ordered, just gone. In that single word, we hear the unspoken truth of medieval warfare. For all the threats and theatrics, armies knew some men couldn't be chained, not by oath, not by fear. And so the cycle continued. The desperate fled, the cruel punished, the clever adapted, and war marched on, forever chewing up lives and spitting out stories too messy for the history books. Jean de Wavrin wasn't supposed to be a deserter, he was supposed to be a chronicler of war, not a subject of its shame. A Burgundian nobleman turned historian, he fought at the disastrous Battle of Agincourt in 1415, where the French army was decimated by English longbows. But when the tide turned, Wavrin did something extraordinary. He fled. Unlike most deserters, though, he didn't hide his cowardice. Instead, he documented it with startling honesty in his chronicles, writing, "I saw death coming and chose the only path left, the one leading away." His frankness gives us something rare, a first-hand account of the terror that could unmake even a trained knight. Yet Wavrin's story didn't end in disgrace. His flight became a pivot point. After Agincourt, he abandoned the sword for the quill, dedicating his life to recording the very wars he'd failed to endure. In a twist of irony, his Chronicles of England became one of the most trusted sources on the 100 Years' War, proof that sometimes the greatest service a deserter can render isn't on the battlefield, but in telling its truths. Then there was the infamous Pierre Bazile, a French crossbowman who deserted not once, but 3 times during the siege of Orleans. His first 2 escapes earned him lashings, but the third changed history. Captured by the English, he was given a choice: hang or turn his weapon on his own people. He chose betrayal, and his bolt nearly killed Joan of Arc. The shot struck her shoulder during her triumphant assault on the Tourelles, forcing her to retreat. Bazile's name became synonymous with treachery, but his story reveals a darker truth. Many turncoats were just desperate men forced into impossible choices. Not all deserters were reviled. Some became folk heroes, like the Scottish outlaw Johnny Armstrong, who abandoned King James V's army after being denied promised pay. He took to the borderlands, robbing English and Scots alike, until his legend grew so large the king invited him to parley, only to hang him in a trap. Armstrong's defiance resonated with commoners who saw him not as a traitor, but as a man who refused to be cheated. Ballads still sung in the Highlands paint him as a rogue with a code: "I'll flee no fight, but I'll not starve for lies." But perhaps no deserter's fate was as strange as that of Enrique of Malacca, the Malay slave who became Magellan's interpreter, and then his undoing. After years of forced service, Enrique deserted during the explorers' doomed voyage in the Philippines, allegedly whispering local war plans to tribal leaders that led to Magellan's death. Some historians argue he wasn't a traitor at all, but a man finally breaking free. His name barely appears in European records, but in Filipino oral traditions, he's remembered as the whisperer who toppled giants. Each of these figures forces us to rethink the label deserter. Were they cowards, pragmatists, or even visionaries? Wavrin's pen proved mightier than his abandoned sword. Bazile's betrayal nearly altered the course of a nation. Armstrong's defiance became an anthem for the downtrodden, and Enrique's escape rewrote an empire's narrative. Their legacies remind us that in war, the line between villain and survivor is often drawn by the victors, but history, in its messy entirety, rarely fits neatly on either side. A siege wasn't just a battle, it was a slow unraveling of the human spirit. Picture a castle cut off from the world, its wells running dry, its granaries echoing hollow. As weeks stretched into months, soldiers who'd sworn to fight to the last breath found themselves eyeing the enemy campfires beyond the walls, not with hatred but with longing. The true weapon of a siege wasn't the catapult or the battering ram, it was hunger, gnawing away at loyalty until even the bravest began to wonder, what's more sacred, my oath or my survival? History's sieges are littered with stories of defenders who crossed that line. During the siege of Jerusalem in 1187, Saladin's forces reportedly tossed fresh bread over the walls daily, a psychological masterstroke. At first, the Franks mocked the gesture, until the day a starving sergeant lowered a rope and slipped into the Muslim camp, not to fight but to beg. Within a week, a dozen more followed. Chroniclers claim Saladin fed them personally, then sent them back unharmed, their bellies full and their minds seeded with doubt. It was warfare by loaf and ladle. Some defections were acts of cold calculation. In 1449, when the Burgundians besieged the rebellious city of Ghent, their spies spread rumors of a feast awaiting any soldier who deserted. The trick: they only needed to whisper the password, St. Levan's Mercy, at the gates. By the siege's end, over 200 defenders had vanished, many later spotted wearing Burgundian colors. The real genius: the password didn't exist. The Burgundians simply hanged anyone who used it, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of betrayal that shattered Ghent's morale. But not all sieges ended in treachery. Some defenders turned desperation into defiance. At the siege of Château-Gaillard in 1204, French troops trapped inside the fortress's inner ward resorted to eating rats, then leather, then finally the corpses of their own dead. Yet when King Philip offered mercy to any who surrendered, only a handful of mercenaries accepted. The rest fought on, their loyalty calcified by suffering. Their grim endurance became legend, proof that starvation could break men or bind them together like iron. The most fascinating cases were the double games. During the siege of Rhodes in 1480, a Hospitaller knight named Antoine de Ellisle allegedly deserted to the Ottomans, feeding them false intelligence about weak points in the walls. What the Turks didn't know: his betrayal was a ruse approved by the Grand Master, buying time for reinforcements to arrive. When the truth emerged, the Ottomans flayed him alive, but not before his lies had saved the fortress. Sieges laid bare a brutal truth: loyalty was often just the absence of hunger. Yet in that crucible of suffering, some men discovered reserves of courage they never knew they had, while others learned the weight of a single loaf of bread. The real battle wasn't fought on the walls. It raged in the hollow stomachs and whispered debates of those trapped inside, where every crumbling ideal made the next betrayal just a little easier. The promise of steady pay was often the first lie a medieval soldier heard. Kings and lords recruited men with glittering pledges of silver and land, but when the campaign dragged on or the coffers ran dry, those promises dissolved like morning mist. For every knight who rode home to a fiefdom, there were 100 common soldiers left holding empty purses, and that bitter reality drove more desertions than any battlefield fear. Take the case of the English army besieging Calais in 1347. After 6 months without wages, entire companies of archers simply walked away, leaving their longbows stacked against the siegeworks like firewood. Royal records show the crown owed these men the equivalent of 2 years' peasant wages, a debt never paid. Similar scenes played out across Europe. German mercenaries looting their own supply trains when paymasters vanished, French men-at-arms selling their armor to buy bread, Spanish crossbowmen carving protest messages into garrison walls. One such inscription in a Burgos fortress reads, "Fought for God and king, starved for both." The system was rigged from the start. Feudal levies peasants conscripted by their lords technically owed unpaid military service. But as wars grew longer, even these forced recruits expected compensation. When it didn't come, bitterness festered. A revealing account from the 100 Years' War describes a Norman farmer soldier who deserted after his family's crops failed in his absence. His lord had promised the manor would tend his fields, but returned to find his wife and children begging. The chronicler notes he was later caught stealing cheese from an English camp, his hunger outweighing even patriotism. Corruption made matters worse. Quartermasters routinely skimmed soldiers' wages, knowing few would complain when the penalty for insubordination was a noose. In 1422, a whistleblower in the Venetian army exposed a scheme where officers had invented ghost soldiers, fake names on payrolls, to pocket extra wages. The scandal triggered mass desertions when the rank and file realized how deeply they'd been cheated. Even kings played this game. Edward III of England once paid his Welsh archers with royal promissory notes redeemable after victory, then declared them invalid when the war ended. But the most heartbreaking cases were the professional soldiers trapped by debt. Many men-at-arms financed their own equipment through loans, pledging future wages as collateral. When pay failed, creditors seized their homes. A Milanese court record tells of a cavalryman who deserted mid-battle upon learning moneylenders had evicted his blind mother. He was later pardoned not out of mercy, but because the judge's own brother had lost a son to similar circumstances. This economic rot created perverse incentives. Some commanders deliberately withheld wages to keep troops desperate and thus easier to control. Others, like the infamous condottiero Braccio da Montone, let their men plunder enemy territories instead of paying them, turning armies into roving bandit hordes. The line between soldier and outlaw blurred until, for many, desertion wasn't a choice but the only exit from a rigged game. Perhaps the most damning evidence comes from payroll ledgers themselves. Marginal notes reveal the truth behind the numbers: paid half, rest owed, or simply fled, no settlement. These dry administrative scratches tell a louder story than any chronicle. That medieval warfare ran not on loyalty but on broken promises. And when the promises shattered, so did the armies. Folklore held a mirror to medieval society, and the reflection it cast of deserters was anything but simple. In the flickering light of taverns and around village hearths, storytellers spun tales of men who abandoned their posts, sometimes as cautionary monsters, other times as folk heroes too clever to die for a lost cause. Consider the haunting English ballad, The Deserter's Lament, where a young archer flees Agincourt only to be hunted by spectral hounds sent by St. George himself. The message was clear: divine wrath awaited oath breakers. Yet in the very next breath, listeners might hear the rollicking tale of Daft Davy, a Scotsman who faked his own death to escape a lord's army, then returned years later disguised as a traveling dentist to pull his former commander's rotten teeth without anesthesia. The contradictions ran deep. German Spielmannslieder minstrel songs often portrayed deserters as tragic figures trapped between impossible choices. One particularly poignant example tells of a miller's son forced into service who deserts to save his starving village, carrying grain stolen from the army stores. Caught and sentenced to hang, he's miraculously saved when the ropes snap, interpreted by some as divine mercy, by others as simple luck. Meanwhile, French chansons de geste took a harsher view. In the Song of Bertrand du Guesclin, a knight who flees battle is literally chased by his own heraldic lion, the beast tearing its way off his surcoat to shame him before God and country. But the most fascinating legends emerged from borderlands where loyalties were fluid. Welsh Hendred poetry sings of Ygwr a Wynibod, the man who turned, a warrior who switched sides during a conflict between rival princes. Branded a traitor by bards on one side, he's celebrated by the other as a wise man who knew when spears grew dull and causes stale. Similarly, Serbian epics tell of Miloš the deserter, a man who abandons the Ottoman army to warn Christian villages of impending raids. Though reviled by Turks as a faithless dog, Balkan folklore immortalized him as the wolf who came home. Women deserters, though rare in historical records, flourished in folk imagination. Breton lies feature La Fayard, the runaway woman, a noblewoman who disguises herself as a squire to escape an arranged marriage to a cruel knight. When their castle is besieged, she lowers the drawbridge for the attackers, not for gold, but because their captain is her childhood sweetheart. The tale walks a delicate line, condemning her betrayal of family while romanticizing her loyalty to love. Even saints' lives got in on the act. The obscure legend of Saint Gallus describes a Roman soldier who deserts to protect Christian villagers, his military cloak miraculously transforming into a monk's habit mid-flight. What makes these stories so compelling is their refusal to reduce desertion to simple right or wrong. The same culture that hanged real deserters as traitors secretly cheered their fictional counterparts who outwitted greedy lords. A Spanish romance from the Reconquista captures this duality perfectly. It mocks a Moorish soldier who defects to the Christians for a chest of silver, only to find it filled with stones. Then praises his Christian counterpart who does the same, calling it divine justice. The difference, perspective. These weren't just entertainments, they were societal pressure valves. When peasants sang of clever deserters tricking their masters, they were venting frustrations about oppressive feudal systems. When nobles commissioned epics about oath-breakers being devoured by hellhounds, they were reinforcing the hierarchies that kept them in power. Every version served a purpose, revealing medieval Europe's conflicted heart, a world that demanded absolute loyalty but secretly admired those bold enough to choose survival. Perhaps no tale captures this tension better than the Italian Storia di Giovanni Senzapora, Story of Fearless John. A mercenary who deserts after his pay vanishes, Giovanni becomes a bandit, but one who only robs tax collectors and corrupt bishops. The story ends ambiguously. He's caught and hanged, yet villagers secretly cut him down and bury him as a saint. The final line lingers like smoke. Some called him thief, some called him king, and all called him something different when the soldiers weren't listening. In that single sentence, folklore acknowledges what history often won't, that the label, deserter, depends entirely on who's holding the pen. For every deserter who vanished into the woods, there was another who marched straight toward a different kind of battle. One fought not for kings, but for bread and dignity. Peasant revolts across medieval Europe became unexpected havens for army deserters, men already hardened by war but disillusioned with the causes they'd been forced to bleed for. These weren't just soldiers fleeing combat, they were warriors trading one battlefield for another, swapping the hollow promises of lords for the raw fury of the oppressed. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 saw this collision of worlds firsthand, when royal tax collectors began conscripting starving villagers to fight in France. Many deserted at the first opportunity, only to reappear weeks later among the rebel ranks led by Wat Tyler. One chronicle describes a defected archer teaching peasants how to fashion sickles into weapons, his military expertise turning a rabble into a threat that stormed London itself. These deserters brought something priceless to the uprising: knowledge. They knew how armies moved, how castles could be breached, and most crucially, how fragile the illusion of noble invincibility really was. Similar alliances flared across the continent. During the Jacquerie uprising in France, deserters from the ongoing 100 Years' War joined enraged farmers in sacking noble estates. A chilling account from the time notes how one such turncoat, a former man-at-arms, used his insider knowledge to dismantle a drawbridge mechanism, allowing peasants to swarm a castle they'd never have taken alone. For these deserters, the revolt wasn't just about survival. It was vengeance against the system that had cheated them of pay, land, and dignity. but the relationship between deserters and rebels was fraught with tension. Peasants often distrusted these military men, fearing they might betray the cause to regain favor with their old masters. In the German Peasants' War of 1525, rebel leaders initially refused to admit deserters until a charismatic former mercenary named Florian Jaeger convinced them otherwise. His argument, "The lords taught us to kill, let us teach them regret," Jaeger's Black Company, composed largely of army deserters, became one of the rebellion's most feared units until their very skills made them targets. When the tide turned, captured deserters faced doubly brutal punishments, hanged not just as traitors to the crown, but as class traitors who dared arm the rabble. What's often overlooked is how these alliances reshaped rebellions. Without deserters, most peasant armies lacked the tactical know-how to exploit their numbers. The Hussite Wars in Bohemia showed the opposite scenario. When defecting knights joined the rebel cause, they transformed farmers' pitchforks into Revolutionary War wagons that defied imperial armies for decades. One such deserter, Jan Chapek, pioneered the use of mobile artillery knowledge he'd gained serving the enemy. His defection proved that in the right hands, betrayal could become liberation. Yet for all their impact, these stories were systematically erased from official records. Chronicles commissioned by nobles painted deserters rebels as demonic instigators, never acknowledging the broken promises that drove them. A rare surviving rebel manifesto from the Catalan revolt puts it bluntly: "They called us traitors for leaving their wars. What name have they earned for starving our children?" This wasn't just desertion, it was a conscious realignment of loyalty from distant kings to neighboring villages. The pattern repeated wherever war and oppression overlapped. In Florence, wool workers who deserted mercenary companies led the Ciompi revolt. In Russia, runaway soldiers joined the violent Stroganov uprisings against feudal taxes. Even when these rebellions failed, they left an indelible lesson: that the moment a soldier realized he had more in common with the peasants than the princes, the entire medieval order trembled. These men didn't just cross battle lines, they redrew them, proving that sometimes the most dangerous place for a deserter to stand wasn't in hiding, but at the forefront of a revolution. Hidden between the official chronicles and royal decrees are the fragile, ink-stained traces of those who vanished from the medieval battlefield, not in the bold strokes of history, but in the trembling script of personal letters and diaries. These rare fragments, often tucked away in monastery archives or family chests, reveal a truth no official record dares to admit: that behind every act of desertion lay a human voice, whispering fear, love, or despair. Take the hastily scribbled note discovered in a French soldier's prayer book from 1420. Penned by a young archer named Jehan, it reads, "Mammon, forgive me. I cannot die for a king who forgets my name while his dogs eat better than my children." The ink smudges suggest tears or rain, but the words themselves are a gut punch. Jehan's plea wasn't just to his mother, it was to posterity, a raw confession flung across 6 centuries. His fate remains unknown, but his reason for fleeing echoes in dozens of similar scraps: unpaid wages, starving families, and the crushing realization that their lives were currency in a game they'd never win. Then there's the diary of Albrecht of Nuremberg, a German mercenary who chronicled his defection in real time. His entries start with the swagger of a professional, 10 florins a month, and the wine flows like the Danube. But by winter, the tone curdles. The paymaster laughs when we beg. The Italians call us hungry ghosts. Today, I ate my glove. His final entry, dated the night he deserted, is chillingly matter-of-fact, gone to the Venetians. They feed their dogs meat. If God condemns me, let him try a month in my boots first. Women's voices are rarer but no less powerful. A bundle of letters found in a Spanish convent tells the story of Isabel, a laundress who followed her husband to camp during the Reconquista. When he vanished after a skirmish, she wrote to his commander, "You say he is a coward. I say your ledger owes him 12 months' bread. Send the silver, and I will call him traitor myself." The response, a terse order for her arrest, suggests Isabel's defiance struck a nerve. Her fate, like so many others, dissolves into silence, but the most haunting accounts come from those who didn't survive their flight. A waterlogged journal recovered from a drowned soldier in the Loire River details his weeks as a fugitive, stealing eggs from farms, hiding in haystacks, and finally, the decision to swim for freedom under cover of storm. The last legible line, "The water is colder than the king's mercy," breaks off mid-sentence. These fragments share a common thread, the crushing weight of broken promises. A Hungarian cavalryman's letter home lists the lands he was promised, each item crossed out with increasingly frantic strokes. A Breton sailor's diary recounts how his captain paid the crew in counterfeit coins, laughing as they bit the lead. And in a single surviving line from a Scottish deserter's trial, the accused snaps, "You call it treason when a man picks his bairns over your banner." What makes these whispers so vital is their sheer normality. These weren't grand betrayals orchestrated by scheming nobles, just exhausted people pushed past breaking. A laundress counting unpaid wages, a father weighing his child's hunger against an oath, a teenager realizing too late that glory was a fairy tale for the well-fed. Their words strip away the myth of medieval warfare as a clash of ideals, revealing it instead as what it often was: a desperate scramble for survival, where the real enemy wasn't the opposing army, but the empty purse, the hollow stomach, and the slow dawning understanding that you were never more than a number on a payroll, one that could be erased as easily as ink in rain. The courtroom might seem like the last place you'd find a medieval deserter after all. Justice for oath breakers was usually swift and brutal, but scattered through dusty legal archives are astonishing cases where desperate men stood before judges and fought back with words instead of swords. Their defenses reveal a legal system far more nuanced than we imagine, where clever arguments could sometimes outmaneuver even a king's wrath. Take the case of Robert of Berry, an English longbowman who deserted Edward III's army in 1346. When dragged before the court of King's Bench, he didn't deny fleeing, he weaponized his contract. Robert produced a tattered recruitment scroll proving he'd been promised sixpence daily, then showed meticulous records of 12 weeks without pay. His argument, a lord who breaks his vow first can't demand loyalty after. The judges, faced with this paper trail of broken promises, commuted his hanging to a fine. Legal scholars still debate whether it was mercy or embarrassment that swayed them. Royal account books from that season show a suspicious rush of back pay issued to troops. Other deserters played the religious card. In 1403, a French squire named Jacques Lefebvre claimed sanctuary after deserting, arguing his captain had forced him to loot a convent. Church lawyers pounced, framing his flight not as cowardice but as divine intervention. Why else would God have guided his steps to holy ground? The Bishop of Rheims even testified that Jacques had returned the stolen sacramental wine. He walked free with penance while his former commander faced excommunication. Then there were those who turned the tables entirely. German mercenary Hans Metzger's trial in 1488 became legendary when he presented a ledger showing his employer had sold the company's food supplies for personal profit. "A man can't betray those who already betrayed him," he declared. The stunned judge not only acquitted him but ordered the paymaster arrested, though locals noted the man mysteriously vanished before sentencing. The most heartbreaking defenses came from those citing abuse. Spanish court records tell of a teenage conscript, Miguel, who deserted after his sergeant broke his hand for missing a shot. He presented his festering wound as evidence, along with testimony from camp surgeons who'd been ordered to withhold treatment. The judges, all veteran soldiers themselves, ruled his abandonment justified, with one muttering about officers who confuse cruelty with command. But legal salvation often depended on sheer luck. A Venetian sailor who deserted during the War of Chioggia was spared because his lawyer found an obscure maritime law requiring captains to provide vinegar for scurvy, a rule ignored for months. Meanwhile, an identical defense failed in Genoa when the judge happened to be the shipowner's cousin. Justice, it seems, was as uneven as medieval cobblestones. These courtroom dramas expose a truth rarely taught, that even in an age of absolute monarchies, the law could sometimes bend for the little man, not often. Not fairly, but just enough to keep hope alive, and to remind kings that even the lowest soldier had a voice if he dared to use it. Deserting a medieval ship wasn't just an act of defiance, it was a death wish disguised as escape. On land, a runaway soldier might vanish into forests or blend into crowds, but the sea offered no such mercy. Imagine standing on the deck of a creaking carrack, surrounded by endless water, knowing every splash could be a shark or a sentry's blade. The moment you jumped, you weren't just breaking your oath, you were gambling against the elements themselves. Naval deserters faced obstacles unimaginable to their land-bound counterparts. First, the sheer isolation. Ships were floating prisons, often weeks from port, with lookouts scanning the horizon for any hint of rebellion. A would-be deserter couldn't simply slip away during a night march. He had to conquer the geography of the vessel itself. The hold was guarded, the rigging watched, and the longboats chained. Some tried hiding among cargo, only to suffocate in grain barrels or be crushed by shifting wine casks. The Venetian archives describe a sailor who stowed away in a salt bin, his body discovered months later, preserved like a cod, a grim warning to others. Then there was the punishment. Captains ruled their ships as petty kings, and their justice was swift and theatrical. A deserter caught mid-flight might be lashed to the mast during a storm, his screams drowned by thunder. Others were forced to walk the plank centuries before pirates made it infamous. Ottoman naval logs mention Christian captives prodded off gangplanks into the Aegean as their former crewmates watched. The French preferred keel hauling, dragging a man under the ship's hull until the barnacles flayed him raw. These weren't just penalties, they were performances designed to paralyze even the thought of escape. Yet still they tried. The boldest stole skiffs under cover of fog, like the Genoese oarsmen who vanished during a Corsican raid in 1412, leaving only a mocking note, gone fishing for better wages. Others faked drownings. One Breton sailor sewed stones into his cloak and sank during a swim call, only to surface miles downstream and stagger ashore. The luckiest found unlikely allies. A Hamburg chronicle tells of a cook who hid deserters in the soup galley, smuggling them ashore inside empty flour sacks when the ship resupplied. The risks escalated during wartime. Fleeing a naval blockade meant swimming through debris and corpses, as a Flemish deserter did during the siege of Calais, dodging arrows and drowning horses to reach the English line. Some turncoats switched flags mid-battle, like the Castilian gunners who rebelled against their captain during a clash with the Portuguese, turning their cannons on their own deck. Their reward, full pardon from Portugal's king and a share of the plunder, but the most daring escapes blurred the line between desertion and mutiny. In 1453, the entire crew of a Burgundian supply ship staged a desertion by marooning their officers on a sandbar and sailing to Morocco, where they sold the vessel and opened a tavern. Their fate surprisingly mild. The Duke, embarrassed by the scandal, quietly struck their names from the rolls rather than admit his navy had been outwitted by drunkards. What drove men to attempt such hopeless flights? Often, it was the unique horrors of naval life. Scurvy turned gums to pulp, maggots infested hardtack, and freshwater turned green with algae. Press-ganged sailors kidnapped from taverns and docks had no loyalty to begin with. And then there were the unspeakable abuses. Venetian naval codes openly permitted captains to withhold pay until voyage's end, knowing many wouldn't live to collect it. Small wonder some chose the gamble of open water over certain misery aboard. Naval desertion forced medieval societies to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the sea, for all its dangers, could still seem kinder than the hands of men. Every splash over the rail wasn't just a bid for freedom, it was a verdict on the world they left behind. And in those desperate leaps, we see the darkest reflection of all, that some fates are so cruel, even drowning becomes a mercy. Mountains didn't just mark borders on medieval maps, they were gateways to vanishing. For a deserter fleeing through the Alps or Pyrenees, every rocky pass offered both peril and promise. The same peaks that slowed armies to a crawl became highways for the desperate, their hidden trails known only to shepherds and smugglers. A Welsh chronicle tells of two archers who disappeared into Snowdonia after the Battle of Bryn Glas, surviving for years in caves once used by rebel princes. When bounty hunters finally tracked them down, the men had married local women and fathered children who spoke only the old mountain dialects, living proof that geography could rewrite identities as easily as it concealed bodies. Forests played a different game. The vast woodlands of Europe, Sherwood, the Black Forest, the Broceli, and were nature's conspiracy against authority. Under dense canopies, a man could disappear within minutes, his trail swallowed by undergrowth, but these green sanctuaries demanded their own prices. Deserters who sought refuge in the woods often joined the outlaws already lurking there, forming makeshift families bound by shared desperation. Records from 15th century Lorraine describe a band of runaway soldiers and poachers who built treehouse villages high in the oaks, complete with rope bridges to evade capture. Their downfall came not through violence, but when a harsh winter forced them to steal from a monastery, only to be betrayed by the very monks who'd been secretly supplying them. Rivers, though, were the great double-edged swords of desertion. What began as a barrier could become a lifeline in desperate hands. A Burgundian pikeman might wade into the Loire with nothing but an inflated wineskin for buoyancy, letting the current carry him beyond pursuit. But rivers also betrayed. English muster rolls from the 100 Years' War note multiple cases of deserters found drowned, their bodies snagged on fishing weirs with purses of unpaid wages still tied to their belts. The luckiest learned to read waterways like maps, the Rhine's smuggling channels, the Danube's hidden sandbars where renegade boatmen waited for paying passengers. One Venetian account even mentions a deserter who floated past an entire enemy camp inside a hollowed-out log, breathing through a reed like the ancient spies of legend. Coastlines offered their own cruel poetry. A sailor who jumped ship in Normandy might find temporary shelter among the tidal marshes, where locals hunted eels and kept secrets as slippery as their catch. But the sea was a fickle ally. Tides could trap a man in quicks, and as easily as they concealed his footprints. The most audacious coastal deserters didn't hide at all. They walked into fishing villages and claimed to be shipwrecked sailors, banking on maritime superstitions about aiding those the sea had spared. A Cornwall court roll from 1392 acquits one such castaway after he correctly recited the local prayer to St. Nicholas, a trick likely learned from actual survivors during his army's coastal marches. Borderlands where kingdoms blurred became deserts of opportunity. In regions like Alsace or the Scottish Marches, a man could change allegiances as easily as he swapped hats. These liminal spaces thrived on ambiguity, their populations well practiced in looking the other way. A Spanish soldier fleeing the Reconquista might cross into Granada and convert to Islam, just as a Lithuanian pagan could find sanctuary among Teutonic knights by feigning baptism. The true art was mastering the border's unwritten rules: when to speak a new language loudly, when to keep silent, and which saints or shrines to invoke depending on which side of the valley you woke in. Geography didn't just shape desertion, it dictated the terms of forgiveness. In mountain villages, a deserter might be welcomed if he brought skills, a blacksmith's strong arm or a hunter's knowledge of passes. Along trade rivers, fluency in dialects could mean the difference between being sheltered or sold out. And in the lawless heaths where royal authority faded, survival often hinged on something simpler: whether the locals hated tax collectors more than they feared kings. The land itself became a co-conspirator, its cliffs and thickets whispering to those who knew how to listen, sometimes offering sanctuary, other times sentencing men to slow starvation. But for those who learned its language, the difference between a death sentence and a new life might be as narrow as a deer path, or as wide as a moonlit river flowing toward the unknown. History has a way of rewriting reputations, especially for those who dared to walk away before finding their way back. Among the countless medieval deserters who vanished into obscurity, a handful performed such extraordinary acts that their earlier flight was forgiven, or even forgotten. Consider the curious case of Gilles de Rais, the Breton knight who deserted Joan of Arc's army after her capture, only to later ransom entire villages from English raiders with his stolen fortune. The same man who fled one battlefield became a folk hero in another region, his earlier cowardice eclipsed by his reckless generosity. Then there was the German mercenary Klaus Störtebeker, whose name literally meant empty the mug in one gulp. After deserting the Teutonic Knights during their brutal Prussian crusades, he turned pirate, but with a twist. When captured ships pleaded poverty, Störtebeker would demand only what they could spare, earning a Robin Hood reputation among Baltic fishermen. His legend grew so large that when he was finally caught and sentenced to execution, he allegedly bargained with the Hamburg Council to spare as many of his crew as he could walk past after being beheaded. The story goes that his headless body staggered past 11 men before the executioner tripped him, a tale so outrageous it might just be true. Some deserters earned redemption through sheer audacity. During the Siege of Belgrade in 1456, a Hungarian gunner named János had already fled 2 battles when he found himself trapped in the city as the Ottomans attacked. With nothing left to lose, he single-handedly manned an abandoned cannon, firing at the enemy until the barrel glowed red. His desperate stand bought time for reinforcements to arrive, and King Matthias Corvinus personally pardoned his past desertions, quipping, "A man who fights like 10 devils deserves 10 second chances." Women who crossed lines could also rewrite their stories. The French chronicler Jean Froissart tells of a nameless camp follower who deserted during the Black Prince's chevauchée, only to reappear months later as the leader of a peasant militia. Armed with nothing but stolen knives and kitchen tools, her band ambushed English supply trains so effectively that local lords offered her a formal truce, an unthinkable concession for a woman, let alone a deserter. Though history never recorded her fate, the ballads that sprang up in her wake called her La Fortueuse, the Reaper, for how swiftly she cut down arrogant soldiers. Even religion offered paths to redemption. After deserting the Crusades, a Flemish knight named Hendrik van Breda supposedly walked barefoot from Venice to Rome as penance, then joined a monastery in the Alps. His quiet life might have gone unnoticed until he saved an entire village from an avalanche by ringing the abbey bells non-stop for an hour, sacrificing his own hands to frostbite in the process. The Pope himself declared his desertion washed clean by greater love, proving that sometimes the most powerful acts of courage happen far from any battlefield. These stories force us to confront a messy truth. The line between coward and hero isn't just drawn by actions, but by who's telling the tale. A deserter who robbed the rich became a criminal in court records, but a savior in tavern songs. A runaway knight might be branded a traitor in one kingdom while being celebrated as a saint in the next. What united them wasn't just their second acts of bravery, but their refusal to let one terrible choice define them forever. In the end, their greatest rebellion wasn't against their commanders, but against the idea that a man who once ran could never learn to stand. Medieval tapestries and illuminated manuscripts rarely showed deserters cowering in fear. Instead, they often depicted them mid-stride, caught between two worlds. In the Tres Riches Heroes du Duc de Berry, a stunning 15th-century prayer book, one marginal illustration shows a knight discarding his surcoat in a thicket while angels and demons tug at his arms. This wasn't just art, it was a theological debate stitched in gold leaf. Is the man a coward abandoning his post, or a soul choosing salvation over slaughter? The ambiguity is deliberate. Even the church couldn't decide whether desertion was a sin or a silent protest against war's horrors. Literature amplified this moral gray area. In the Song of Roland, the epic French poem, the traitor Gainlon is reviled, but later versions add a curious twist. His nephew, a young squire, flees the doomed battle at Roncesvalles and lives to tell the tale. Unlike his uncle, he's not condemned but pitied, his survival framed as divine mercy rather than disgrace. Meanwhile, German Minnesang poetry often featured knights who deserted for love, their actions romanticized even as their reputations crumbled. The message context mattered. A man who ran from greed was damned. One who ran for a woman's embrace might be redeemed. But the most fascinating portrayals emerged in folk drama. English mystery plays sometimes included a character called Every Soldier, who'd monologue about war's futility before tossing his weapons into the audience. In one surviving script from York, the crowd was instructed to pass the prop sword back, a symbolic rejection of his choice. Yet records show some performances ended differently, with spectators keeping the sword as a souvenir. The same character could be judged or celebrated, depending on which town's prejudices colored the crowd. Artistic depictions also exposed societal hypocrisies. A 14th-century fresco in Siena's Palazzo Pubblico shows a deserter hanged outside the city walls while just feet away. Another painting glorifies mercenaries charging into battle. The unspoken question lingers: if selling your sword to the highest bidder was honorable, why was refusing to die for free a crime? Even illuminated chronicles played both sides. The Chroniques de France illustrates English deserters as rat-faced villains, while French turncoats get tragic, almost heroic lighting, their faces anguished but noble. The tension peaked in depictions of women who aided deserters. A Bavarian wood carving shows a milkmaid hiding a runaway soldier under her skirts as guards search her farm. She's not painted as a temptress but as a shrewd protector, her finger pressed to her lips in a universal gesture of silence. Contrast that with the Roman de la Rose, where women who shelter deserters are allegorized as fraud, strangling, loyalty. The difference: one was folk art made by peasants who knew war's toll. The other was aristocratic propaganda meant to shame dissent. These cultural fingerprints reveal a medieval world wrestling with its own contradictions. For every stained glass window damning deserters as Judas figures, There's a tavern song praising their cunning. A knight's effigy might be defaced for cowardice, while the same village children play games where the hero escapes the evil king's army. The truth lay somewhere in the brushstrokes and ballads. That honor was always in the eye of the beholder, and survival, in the end, had its own poetry. The moment before desertion wasn't just an act of physical escape. It was a psychological earthquake, shattering the very foundations of a soldier's identity. Imagine standing in the pre-dawn gloom, your breath shallow as you edge past sleeping comrades. Every rustle of chainmail feels like an accusation. Every snore from a fellow soldier echoes with betrayal. The weight of that decision wasn't merely the fear of capture. It was the crushing guilt of abandoning men who'd shared your hunger, your terror, your dwindling hope. Medieval chronicles rarely dwell on this inner turmoil, but when they do, the details are haunting. A Swiss mercenary's diary from 1451 describes how he wept into his helmet before fleeing, not from cowardice, but because he couldn't bear to watch another boy from his village die for a cause neither understood. What's often overlooked is how medieval society weaponized guilt to bind men to their posts. The church preached that desertion wasn't just a military crime, it was a mortal sin, a rupture in the divine order. Soldiers were told their souls would wander eternally if they broke their oaths, a fear exploited by commanders who planted priests in the ranks to whisper of hellfire. Yet even this spiritual terror couldn't silence the louder, more primal instinct, survival. A French archer's letter to his sister confesses, "I fear God's wrath, but my children's empty bellies scream louder than any priest." Hope, though, was the most dangerous emotion of all. Deserters didn't just run from something, they ran toward a fragile dream. A Catalan soldier's trial record includes his delirious sketch of a farm he'd never owned, drawn in the margins of his confession. He'd been promised land after the campaign, but when the rewards vanished, so did he, not into the wilderness, but toward the hills where he'd imagined planting vines. Psychologists call this future projection, the ability to envision a life beyond trauma. For medieval deserters, that mental image, a hearth, a lover's smile, a field unburned by war, was often the only compass they had. The real tragedy, many discovered too late that their old lives no longer existed. A German knight who deserted the Teutonic Order returned home after 20 years to find his family's land seized, his name synonymous with shame. Chroniclers say he lived out his days as a hermit, carving his coat of arms into tree trunks not to reclaim his honor, but to remind himself he'd once been someone else. Others found their guilt transformed into something unexpected. An English longbowman who fled Agincourt later became a lay brother at Westminster Abbey, where he spent decades silently scrubbing bloodstains from the cloister floors. His confessor's notes simply say, "He washes what cannot be cleansed." These stories force us to abandon simplistic judgments. Desertion wasn't just an act of fear or defiance. It was a collision of shattered loyalties, where love for family clashed with duty to comrades, where hope warred with despair. The medieval mind had no therapy, no vocabulary for PTSD, only the raw struggle to reconcile survival with self-worth. When a soldier stepped across that invisible line, he wasn't just risking his neck, he was gambling his very sense of who he was. And in that gamble, win or lose, he became something rarely acknowledged in the Chronicles, utterly, unbearably human. Even crusades, those holy wars where men swore oaths on relics and marched under God's banner, couldn't silence the whispers of doubt. For every knight who reached Jerusalem, another vanished into the Anatolian night, his footprints erased by desert winds. These weren't faithless men, but souls torn between divine duty and the unbearable weight of reality. Starvation that turned zealots into skeletons, diseases that rotted flesh faster than sin, and the dawning realization that paradise might lie behind them, not ahead. Consider the grim arithmetic of the First Crusade. Chroniclers claim over 30,000 soldiers reached Antioch, yet by the time they pushed south, thousands had melted away. Some left traces, a Norman knight's confession scribbled in a monastery ledger, admitting he'd bribed a sailor to take him back to Sicily. Others became ghosts, like the German pilgrims who allegedly joined a Seljuk caravan as guards, trading crosses for turbans to survive. The church called them apostates, but their choices spoke of something more human, the instinct to live long enough to repent. The justifications for fleeing a holy war were as layered as the armor left behind. A Flemish chronicle tells of a group who deserted after witnessing their bishop, the same man who'd preached the crusade as God's will, hoarding wine and bread while commoners starved. If Christ's servant eats like a king while his soldiers die like dogs, where is the holiness? One reportedly shouted before leading 50 men back to the coast. Others clung to theological loopholes. A priest's letter from the Third Crusade describes a knight who claimed the Virgin Mary appeared to him in a dream, ordering him home to protect his family from bandits. The bishop scoffed, but the man's comrades let him go. After all, who could argue with a vision? Clever desertions bordered on the theatrical. During the siege of Acre, 2 French knights allegedly staged a duel, complete with fake wounds, so their squires could smuggle them out disguised as corpses on a burial cart. Another group in the same campaign pretended to capture each other, escaping toward Jerusalem by night while actually riding west, the most brazen. A contingent of Italian mercenaries who sold their siege engines to Saladin's forces, then used the gold to book passage home, claiming they were simply carrying God's wealth to safety. Religious authorities fought back with propaganda and punishment. Deserters' names were read aloud in churches, their lands seized by the church as unfulfilled vows. The most notorious cases faced ritual humiliation. Stripped of their cloaks, they were forced to walk barefoot to shrines, wearing signs that read "Oathbreaker" in Latin and vernacular. Yet even these measures faltered. A bishop's journal from the Albigensian Crusade complains that villages often hid returning deserters, sneaking them back into civilian life with fresh haircuts and forged marriage certificates. One such fugitive, Pierre of Toulouse, supposedly lived openly as a baker for years until a visiting monk recognized him only for the townsfolk to chase the cleric out with stones. The Crusade's greatest irony, some deserters became accidental peacemakers. A German nun's chronicle tells of a runaway Templar who settled in Damascus, marrying a Syrian Christian woman and brokering trades between Muslim merchants and captive crusaders. Another, an English archer left behind after the failed Children's Crusade, taught olive farming to Berber tribes in exchange for sanctuary. These men didn't just abandon their vows, they rewrote them, finding holiness not in conquest, but in the quiet acts of survival that no chronicler could condemn without exposing war's ugliest truth. That sometimes the most sacred thing a man could do was lay down his sword and walk away. Forging a new life after desertion required more than just a change of clothes. It demanded the meticulous construction of an entire false history, brick by brick. Some turn to the oldest trick in the book, the pilgrim's disguise, a stolen scallop shell sewn onto a cloak, a mumbled Latin prayer, and suddenly a runaway soldier became a penitent traveler bound for Santiago de Compostela. The roads teemed with such wanderers, their stories interchangeable enough to deflect suspicion. One Burgundian deserter reportedly carried a hollowed-out staff filled with forged relics. When questioned, he'd produce a sacred chicken bone, instantly silencing doubters with the aura of holiness. Others weaponized the medieval world's obsession with paperwork. A well-bribed scribe could alter a military role or forge a letter of introduction, transforming a wanted man into a distant cousin from some obscure village. The trick was in the details. A convincing backstory required local knowledge. Deserters who'd campaigned in Flanders might claim to be cloth merchants from Bruges, peppering their lies with accurate descriptions of guild halls and wool tariffs. The luckiest found accomplices in actual tradesmen like the English archer who apprenticed himself to a Genos glassblower in exchange for the man's silence, spending years hunched over a furnace until his bowman's calluses were replaced by burn scars. Language itself became a tool for reinvention. A Welsh longbowman captured in French service might suddenly remember his childhood in Gascony, affecting a southern accent so convincingly that his new comrades never suspected his true origins. The most adept linguistic chameleons didn't just change dialects, they switched languages entirely. Hanseatic League records mention a Lithuanian deserter who posed as a deaf-mute Danish sailor for a decade, communicating only in gestures until his death revealed a pouch of Baltic coins sewn into his tunic. But the boldest schemes involved full-scale identity theft. When a Spanish man at arms named Rodrigo drowned during the Granada campaign, 3 of his comrades allegedly drew lots for the right to assume his name and noble papers. The winner traveled to Rodrigo's ancestral home, where he charmed the dead man's elderly mother into accepting him, though chroniclers note she later confessed to knowing the truth, keeping silent because his smile had the same sadness as my son's. The church provided unexpected cover for some. A deserter with half-remembered Latin could join a monastery as a lay brother, his military past buried under layers of ritual. More creative still were those who exploited the period's superstitious fears. A German mercenary turned himself into a cursed wanderer, claiming to be under a witch's spell that would strike dead anyone who hindered his journey. The ruse worked for 8 years until he tried it on a skeptical Venetian physician who promptly had him arrested for fraud. These reinventions came at a cost. The French knight Olivier de la Marche wrote of meeting a once feared English captain reduced to tending pigs in Burgundy, his hands shaking too badly to hold a sword. He called himself Pierre now, de la Marche noted, but when drunk he still shouted orders to long-dead men. The deepest disguise couldn't erase muscle memory or night terrors. For every successful transformation, there were those like the anonymous soul scratched into a monastery wall. I was someone else yesterday. I will be no one tomorrow. Yet the sheer ingenuity of these survival tactics reveals a truth more powerful than any oath. That identity in the Middle Ages was as fluid as the boundaries between kingdoms. A name could be discarded like a blood-stained tunic, a past rewritten with the right props and audacity. In a world where kings justified wars through divine right, these men and women mastered a different kind of sovereignty, the art of becoming whoever they needed to be to see another sunrise. When the Black Death swept across Europe in the 1300s, it didn't just decimate populations, it unraveled the very fabric of medieval loyalty. Armies that had once marched in rigid formation now disintegrated like parchment in the rain, as soldiers faced a foe no sword could pierce. The plague's relentless march blurred the lines between duty and survival, turning desertion from a crime into an act of grim necessity. Imagine a camp where the coughing of the dying drowned out the sergeant's orders, where the stench of rotting flesh made the threat of execution seem almost merciful. In such a world, why die for a lord who couldn't protect you from the air itself? The numbers tell a staggering story. During the worst years of the pandemic, chroniclers note entire garrisons abandoning their posts not to the enemy, but to the invisible specter of disease. In Lombardy, a detachment of Milanese crossbowmen simply walked away from a siege, their captain's diary lamenting. They chose to risk the noose rather than share a tent with the fevered. Even the feared Teutonic Knights, whose iron discipline was legendary, recorded over 500 desertions in a single year as men fled their Baltic strongholds for isolated villages. The punishment pointless, as one Prussian commander scrawled in frustration, "You cannot hang a ghost, opportunistic desertions flourished in the chaos." With entire regions depopulated, fleeing soldiers could vanish into the countryside, taking over abandoned farms or assuming the identities of the dead. A French chronicle describes a band of deserters who occupied a vacant monastery in Provence, posing as monks until local authorities noticed their terrible Latin and sword-calloused hands. Elsewhere, the breakdown of record-keeping became a fugitive's best ally. In England, muster rolls from the period show scribbles like "presumed dead" next to names of men who'd clearly slipped away, their disappearances blamed on the plague to cover commanders' embarrassment. The pandemic also exposed the hypocrisy of feudal obligations. When lords fled to their country estates to escape the pestilence, their abandoned soldiers saw little reason to hold the line. A bitter Welsh ballad from the time mocks a nobleman who demanded loyalty from his troops while his carriage wheels kicked dust into their dying faces. In some cases, the ranks turned on their masters outright. German city archives tell of a garrison that locked its aristocratic officers inside the plague ward before deserting en masse, leaving them to share their common soldiers' fate. Yet amid the suffering, the Black Death inadvertently birthed new forms of solidarity. Deserters from opposing armies sometimes banded together in the wilderness, their old enmities meaningless in the face of a shared scourge. A remarkable account from Burgundy describes French and English stragglers forming a makeshift village in the Jura Mountains, their truce brokered by a defrocked priest who'd also fled his post. They survived by hunting and trading with terrified locals, their very presence a quiet rebellion against the wars that had sent them to die. The plague's aftermath reshaped warfare itself. With populations halved, surviving soldiers found their labor suddenly valuable and their loyalty negotiable. Lords who'd once hanged deserters now offered double wages and land grants to retain troops. In Italy, mercenary companies exploited the labor shortage to demand unheard-of concessions, like contracts allowing them to quit campaigns if disease struck. The balance of power had shifted, if only for a moment, proving that even in the darkest times, survival could rewrite the rules of allegiance. What lingers most is the haunting humanity of these choices. The Black Death didn't just make desertion easier, it revealed how fragile the bonds of feudalism truly were when faced with the universal equalizer of mortality. In the end, the plague taught a brutal lesson, that no oath could outweigh the will to live, and no border could contain the desperation of those who'd seen hell on earth and chose to walk away. Centuries may separate us from medieval battlefields, but the agonizing choices faced by deserters echo through time with unsettling familiarity. Today's soldiers, like their chainmail-clad ancestors, still grapple with the collision of duty and survival. Only now, the stakes are amplified by drones, PTSD diagnoses, and 24-hour news cycles. Consider the haunting parallels. A 14th-century archer slipping away from Agincourt under cover of fog isn't so different from a 21st-century contractor abandoning a Cabal outpost, both men vanishing into landscapes where their own side might shoot them on sight. The uniforms change, the human calculus doesn't. Modern armies still confront the same brutal arithmetic that plagued medieval commanders: how to retain fighters when the cause grows murky or the body count soars. During the Iraq War's bloodiest years, the military reported desertion rates not seen since Vietnam, with many citing moral disillusionment alongside the medieval classics of unpaid bonuses and fraudulent recruitment. One soldier's handwritten note left at Camp Liberty could have been lifted from a 100 Years' War chronicle. They promised honor, they delivered body bags and lies. Just as medieval lords blamed cowardice for desertions rather than starvation or broken promises, modern generals often frame the issue as discipline failures rather than systemic betrayals. The psychological toll reveals even deeper connections. Medieval chronicles describe knights haunted by battle madness after too many campaigns, a precursor to today's PTSD. A French manuscript from the Albigensian Crusade depicts a knight screaming at phantom Saracens in his sleep, his squire noting, "He fights wars unseen long after the truce." Fast forward to a 21st century VA hospital where veterans describe identical hypervigilance and night terrors. The key difference: modern deserters sometimes have diagnoses to justify their flight, like the National Guardsman who walked away from his unit after 3 tours, citing untreated trauma. His defense, "I wasn't leaving the army left me to rot," would have resonated with a medieval mercenary gutting it out for pay that never came. Technology has transformed desertion's methods, but not its motives. Where medieval defectors forged pilgrimage papers, today's vanish into the digital ether. One U.S. Marine was apprehended in Mexico after a decade offline, living off-grid under a dead man's social security number. Social media now fuels the same kind of disillusionment that once spread through tavern ballads. YouTube videos of civilian casualties circulate like the medieval, seditious songs that turned troops against the Crusades. And just as medieval mercenaries switched sides for better pay, contemporary private military contractors famously abandon contracts mid-deployment when rivals offer signing bonuses, proving gold still talks louder than flags. Perhaps the most poignant parallel lies in the stories of those who cross lines for love. Where a medieval knight might desert to marry his enemy's daughter, modern counterparts face similar heartbreaks. A declassified Pentagon report reveals multiple cases of soldiers defecting to Afghanistan after falling for local interpreters, their fates mirroring the tragic border-crossing romances of the Reconquista. Even military justice shows eerie continuity. Where medieval deserters faced firing squads or branding, the U.S. Army still retains the death penalty for desertion during war, a punishment last carried out in 1945, but still looming in the uniform code like a spectral threat. What these threads reveal is a truth that transcends time, that war's first casualty is never innocence but consent. From Agincourt to Fallujah, the moment a fighter realizes they've become expendable to distant powers, the bonds of loyalty fray. The medieval peasant who tossed aside his lord's banner and the modern drone operator who walks away from the console share the same revelation, that survival, in the end, is the most human rebellion of all. And in that realization, 700 years collapse into a single, unbroken line of quiet defiance. The stories of medieval deserters and defenders who crossed battle lines force us to confront an uncomfortable truth: that war has always been less about grand ideologies than the quiet, desperate choices of individuals. These weren't faceless traitors or nameless cowards, but fathers who couldn't bear the thought of their children starving, lovers who risked everything for a single stolen embrace, soldiers who realized too late they'd been fed lies with their rations. Their actions expose the fragility of feudal oaths, revealing how quickly loyalty crumbles when survival whispers alternatives. What makes their legacies so enduring is how little divides their dilemmas from our own. A 15th century mercenary flipping allegiances for better pay mirrors today's contractor switching private military firms. The Welsh archer who deserted to protect his village isn't so different from the modern soldier who leaks classified documents to expose civilian casualties. The means change, but the human tensions remain. Duty versus conscience, orders versus morality, the abstract demands of kings against the visceral pull of home. These medieval voices also challenge our romanticized view of the past. Chivalry's glittering facade cracks under the weight of their testimonies, letters begging for back pay, trial records detailing self-inflicted wounds to escape service, ballads celebrating outlaws who robbed tax collectors. They remind us that the Middle Ages weren't just castles and cathedrals, but a time when ordinary people navigated impossible choices with the same mix of courage and compromise we'd recognize today. Perhaps their greatest lesson is how fluid allegiance truly is. Borders shift, causes fade, but the will to endure transcends eras. The Burgundian turncoat who became a folk hero, the crusader who deserted to save his family, the peasant who smuggled bread to both sides of a siege. They all rejected the fiction that war is ever as simple as us versus them. Their lives whisper a question we're still grappling with. How much does any system deserve when it demands your life as currency? So the next time you hear a medieval tale of knights and glory, listen for the quieter stories humming beneath. The deserter's footsteps echoing across mountains, the defender who lowered his sword, the lovers who rewrote their fate in the margins of history. Their choices resonate because they're human choices, messy, brave, flawed, and endlessly relatable. If these hidden histories moved you, share which story stayed with you longest in the comments, and join us as we keep unearthing the past's most gripping forgotten voices. Don't forget to subscribe. The next chapter is always